I don't think he'll interrupt too much.
All right. Well, yeah. ADHD is not a there's not a shortage of it in this little corner of the internet, I'm afraid. I
Mm-mm.
don't
Nah.
think the internet is helping making it any better for all of us.
Yeah.
So, well, let's begin with you. Why don't you?
Yeah.
Listening to that rooster just reminds me of years living in the Dominican Republic. Those doggone things
um.
crow all day long.
Yeah. No. Um. Yeah. Right now I'm living in a farm with my. If he keeps going, I'll move. But right now I'm living sort of just outside of Adelaide with my partner, my 6-month-old daughter, and her parent and my partner's parents. Um, I'm a trainer and like a personal trainer and a poet. And I don't know, I've been following you since I think 2017.
Ooh, very early.
Yeah, yeah. Like majority of the time, it was like I think the situation that you were seeing on the other side was very true. It was like you'd put up a lot of videos, but it was the only ones with Jordan Peterson that I'd really watch. And yeah, like I was figuring out that phenomenon. Was following Jordan probably from 2006 17 really on, and I still quite don't know how to make out of it. And yeah, slowly started. The interesting thing was I was in the slam poetry scene, and which was very, very politically active. And I was organizing events and I was running them and doing so much. And then I didn't realize how full of woke politics or whatever it was until um, I saw Jordan. And then I realized sort of, oh, okay, there's actually a lot that I'm not considering. And for the first few years, it was treating Jordan was like a treating Jordan like a TED talk or like a good scholar. And it was like I'm learning a little more about politics and I'm learning more about like psychology. And the longer and longer it went on, I started reading Tolkien. And then I was like, oh, okay, so there's actually something much deeper that he's sort of referring to. And he has kind of always been referring to. It just took me a short while to sort of get down to the layer that I could understand. It was really interesting. Um,
What tell me about the household you were raised in.
yeah, I'm the
Did they go to
oldest
church?
of two.
Okay.
No, no church. My dad was the first one to ask why are we going to church, and my grandfather was going to church because you go to church. So he didn't really have much of a bulletproof reasoning behind it. And my mum was always trying to understand it and coming up with different answers, and thought that coming up with different answers was more important. So we didn't grow up with religion, uh, but I learned how to meditate. I learned um, different sort of points of different aspects of types of spirituality through them. I um, I don't know, 6, 7 years old, I had a really strong interest in Buddhism,
Six,
and
7 years old at an interest in what on earth caused
yeah,
a 6-year-old to be interested in Buddhism?
Kung Fu, mate, Kung Fu. They'll get you. You get in all those easy ones, man. You're just like, I mean, and you know, we were talking about ADD before. Like, you ever see a 7-year-old kid in a white and orange robes doing perfect handstands on a single finger in a perfect serene leg? You're like, but like, how do you stay still? Like, what are you doing? And mm, it was definitely the bribery of the kung fu that got me onto it. But it was valuable. I learned a lot in it, and I was saying to Nate, when I made it to high school, I was very much into it because you can also be antagonistic and Buddhist at the same time when you're in a Christian society. And I went to a Lutheran school, and my pastor was actually really supportive. Um, it was something I realized where it's just like they just really appreciate it when you care. It was like when you actually have an opinion, it's almost like, yeah, whatever, it's all right,
That's
take
right.
it.
You're already differentiating yourself from the crowd. Oh, he cares about something. There's hope.
Yeah. Um, and yeah, that was the majority of it until I went overseas and I went to an actual Buddhist country. And I said this to Nate, and I was just like, I don't think you can be Buddhist unless you're in a society like that. Like, there is so much in the way that they operate in their daily lives that is that if you don't have it, it feels like you're missing a large portion of it. Like, um, they you hear prayers like 6 times a day, just openly, like in every corner of the temple. People become novices, like, which are on the way to monks, not because they want to, but because they are honoring a passing relative, or sometimes they can't, they just take the education, and on top of that they have to wake up at this time in the morning and walk around their village collecting food from strangers, and they're only allowed to eat that food that they're given. And it's just like, when there is such an intense community and there's such a like intense network of how people are sort of relating to each other, it's just like sitting, meditating, contemplating this strange, I don't know, it's like it almost turns Neoplatonic in some academic way. And then you look, and then at the same time, it becomes very polytheistic, and it talks about some incredibly crazy mythologies. It's just like you can't you can't help but put your own intentions in there. You can't help but not really sort of pay attention to what you might be needing to pay attention to. And also, you also get called into a life that basically not many people can do. Like, um, it's interesting learning about like spiritual perfection within a Christian sense, but it's a lot more personal that you can access. Whereas the only thing you can really do is follow the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. And the first of the Noble Truth, all life is suffering. The second Noble Truth, all suffering is from attachment to the material world. And it's just like, okay, so separate, separate, separate. And it's just like, okay. And yeah, I started reading a lot of Tolkien, um, and then got into a lot of Lewis, and then I started listening to a lot of Ewan Peugeot, like going really, really into it. And then I think I, I want to say it was Andrea with the bangs. You had a conversation with her, and I don't know if it was the first or second one, but you actually had a strange forcefulness in your conversation with her, which was really interesting. Um, because it was the first time you kind of said like the only thing we can do is be a good Christian, or like the only thing we can do is operate at a good being. Because you were talking to another Christian, that's kind of how the conversation went. And I realized I was like, oh, okay, I have to be in this. And so yeah, I've started going to church, started reading a lot more into it, and I'm still way more confused than I was when I started.
Well, the confusion doesn't just go away in this world. There's plenty of that to go around.
No, but you get a lot of wonder.
You do get a lot of wonder. Yeah, that's true too. That's true too. So, what have you noticed? What kind of a church are you going to, and what have you noticed?
I go to Catholic. I go to the only church that does a Tridentine Latin Mass. And the main thing I've noticed is what's the best way to put it? The stuff that I disagree the most with within the church, whether that just be the discipline stuff or whether that be the judgments on people's and their behavior and stuff like that, it's become more useful to me by not by allowing myself to have it only apply to me and have it only be reflected into things that I have happen in my life and how I wrestle with problems and how I wrestle with authority and things. Because I remember like my friend invited me to the church and then we started talking about it and he was just like, well, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. You up for it? And like my first thing was nope, immediately. And I was just like, oh my God. I'm just like, immediately, the moment I'm asked to do anything, I say no. And I thought that was really curious. And I was like, that's surprising. And I think, it's been good having Jordan on the way as well, because like the Israel, those who wrestle with God was like a wrestling match is something that does require you to lose and does require me to sort of fail. Like, and it's just like, oh, there's like some stuff I'm like, I don't think I can do it. It's like, the goal isn't to do it. The goal is to wrestle with it. That's been cool. And I thought it was really strange. My perception of Jesus just keeps getting crazier and crazier and crazier. It's I said to Nate, the last thing that really made sense in Christianity was the crucifixion, which I think is really strange, but at the same time I don't know, because I had nothing to relate to with the sacrifice, with the crucifixion, and it was like Jesus died for our sins. I'm like, okay, like with that much context and that much effort, it felt as important as any other moment in history. And I was just like, oh, but slowly starting to understand that basically you're meant to be front and center right next to him in the Bible. You're meant to be put your entire body in there and experience it as you would as if you were like right in front of him. And when you do that into the crucifixion, I mean, I don't know if I think it seems endless to how meaningful that action can be. But then it also just washes out and goes back into the rest of his life in the Gospels. And this sort of becomes crazier and crazier again.
What does your partner think of your religious interests? Does she join you in this? Is this your journey? How does that play out?
It's definitely my journey. She's she has a very personal relationship with religion and spirituality. Um, I leave it best to her. She grew up high Anglican and still considers herself Anglican as well. But it's within her. I think when we talked about it, and I talk about it badly because I'm a terrible evangelist of my position. I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. This is very confusing for me still. Um, but she prays in silence. She thinks spirituality. Um, the most important thing about it is the peace that it brings an individual, and I think like that's the counterbalance that we have for each other. So majority of the time, you're on in the background. She'll have a vague idea of some stuff, um, but she has a lot more of she's a lot more closer to a lot of the intuitive things that sort of people talk about. Like her and Shari have a lot in common sometimes, and which is really really cool to see. But yeah, she's a yoga instructor who sort of sees a lot of people talk their spirituality and kind of not really think about the other person listening. And so I think she likes to keep her spirituality to herself and let everybody else do as they will.
How long have you been together?
Coming up to 2 years. We met in a bar, was both after a serious breakup. I bought a one-way ticket to New Zealand because I was done, and she was going to have a beautiful time in single land. And we met, and I was like, I'm not letting go of you ever. And then I think 6 months later, she was pregnant. We knew we knew we were serious. We knew we wanted a future, and so it was something that we were ready to embrace. And yeah, it's been really interesting. And now I'm living with her parents and have a child, and so much to contend with.
Do you have any wedding plans yet?
But yes, yes. They're just contingent upon the money and organization and stuff like that. But definitely, she wants a big wedding, so it's just like, okay, so we know it's going to happen. So now we just have to work on that very large, very large wedding, very large organization.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's been really interesting going through the process with her. She's very vulnerable. She seems vulnerable when I invite her to come to church and stuff like that, and very tentative because she sees a lot of people, or she feels like a lot of people would put down her ideas or her importance of the faith and her importance of liturgy and things like that. And people are a lot of people, I think, who especially were intensely in it at a young age, who had to leave, are probably one of the hardest people to sort of come back. But that's sort of like is only really when the goal is to get them to be right next to you, and that's not really the goal, I guess.
So what did you want to talk about today?
I don't know. It's a lot hard to think of everything at 5 a.m. But
yeah, that's true. That's true. This is I mentioned to you early on, I had a conversation with a woman from Australia, and I hadn't been to Australia yet and wasn't fully cognizant of the weird time differential between California and Australia. And so I don't know how we settled at the time, but it was like early in the morning and she was barely awake. It's just like, what's going on? So then
Yeah.
when you suggested these times, I thought, wow, brave man.
Yeah.
Brave
Yeah,
man.
that's it. I work in cafes. It's easy enough. I've been very lucky. I've spoken to Shari, Luke, and Nate, um, and they've all happily had me on at 1 o'clock in the afternoon my time, and I'm just like, oh, this is perfect. Then they keep going. It's like, okay, it's like 12 o'clock. I really got to get going. I'm like, okay. Mm, I don't know. I'm interested in maybe what your thoughts are on Gnosticism, because it feels like, and Gnosticism and I don't know, spiritual epiphany or revelation, because in some senses it does actually feel like I was lucky in being able to see Christianity. It feels like over the last 3 years, a lot of people have had to confront their sense making apparatus, and they've had to question a lot of things, and the question of meaning and sort of what that actually and that relation to their life and the relation between their life and the world has sort of come up. And I don't know, it looks as if a lot of the time people are just they're seeing what's in front of them and what offers them the most meaning, and then they're latching onto it, whether or not that's spirituality, whether or not that's, you know, an extreme QAnon or going the other way, or even whether or not it's a new thing like Islam or stuff like that. I've been listening a lot to James Lindsay again recently. He's a really good person to listen to, but my God, there is so much that he has read, and it's just it's a level of research that I'm almost overwhelmed by.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems like it seems like he's just like, this thing goes back into the moment that we were able to think. Like we were at this war with somebody who was trying. We were at like, yeah, this not religion or this spiritual mode of thought was in contrast to sort of this Christian way of thinking, or pretty much from the beginning. And then wherever there was a ghost of a Christian thought before Christ, it was there as well. And seems like there's this thing in our past that's ever present in every type of faith, every type of ideology, and it seems very easy for people to get a hold of. Um, I don't know. It like a lot of it gets a lot of spiritual, a lot of like, to me, spirituality, a lot of it is more acceptance and surrender in a sense. And so it seems like maybe that's why a lot of people sort of end up being where they sort of land, because of that, the spiritual understanding that they do have to give away some authority, or they have to give away some uh, control away from themselves. But yeah, I don't. That's my start, I suppose.
Well, I used to know a lot more of what we were talking about when we talked about Gnosticism until I learned more, because it
Yeah,
seems that there are lots of there are lots of, this isn't unusual, of course. I mean, because when you talk about Christianity, it is such a vast it's such a vast thing that what aspect of Christianity, because there are a lot of competing definitions that people are using for the term. For example, on Karen Wong's channel, she just had a conversation with Michael, who's very much an OG in this little corner, because Karen had listened to a podcast with James Lindsay on the sovereign nations. I haven't listened to that podcast, but it seems I listened to a little bit of it. It seems like lately James Lindsay's been talking a lot about Gnosticism and the difficulty. And then Karen basically gave her definition of Gnosticism, which was definitely a piece of one of the ancient traditions that tend to get labeled as Gnostic, but it's a broad thing. And for me, the easiest way to sort of think about Gnosticism is to think about upper and lower registers. Upper being mind, heaven, spirit, lower being matter, brain, earth. And Gnosticism tends to go like this. For example, in Gnostic Gospels, Judas is the hero because he facilitates the releasing of Jesus from his physical body. And in that way, the perfecting of Jesus is the loss of his physicality and the pure spirit that Jesus becomes. Now, there's all sorts of philosophical and religious traditions that you can see through this frame. And when you talk about Buddhism and attachment, well, one way to think about it is that way too. And so part of what, and you can even think about this in terms of Jerusalem and Athens, because the Hebrews were Hebrew is a very material language. It's very action oriented. It's very physical. The Greeks tend to get much more idealistic. So you can have idealism that sort of floats up there too. So when we talk about Gnosticism, we can potentially be talking about a lot of different things. I think key to understanding and this too is going to get debated. And even, Nate has a corner of the internet, and there's certain conversations that tend to revolve around Nate, just like there's all these little sub corners within the corner, that sort of constellate around certain channels. So Nate has a channel, and Grizz has a channel, and Jacob has a channel, and not all the channels get along. And so, but they are sort of connected in some ways, thanks to Jordan Peterson. So, I think something foundational to Christianity is the idea that it's about heaven. It's about where heaven and earth meeting. I noticed this fairly early on. I noticed this a long time before I ever got involved in YouTube or any of this kind of stuff. When I began to, growing up in a moderately conservative Protestant denomination, you sort of get the idea that the story is about heaven and hell. And the more you read the Bible and the more you start reading the Bible better, you begin to get a sense that the story is about heaven and earth. And hell is a piece of the conversation, but the main story is about heaven and earth. And it was perhaps N.T. Wright that sort of clued me into that fairly early on, and that then continued on. And then when you get to Jonathan Pageau and Matthew Pageau's book, you begin to see heaven and earth, and then Gnosticism begins to make more sense, and then the Gnostic Gospels make more sense, because and then you begin to understand, like, some forms of Gnosticism that imagined there were sort of two gods. The God of the creator of the physical world was a second tier, second class, not the highest God, because materiality, and the Greeks noted this, materiality is subject to decay. And the Greeks tended to like the ideal, the immaterial. For example, C.S. Lewis will play on this stuff a lot too, because C.S. Lewis makes the point that basically every instantiation of love will end in betrayal or death, whereas love itself, and then we're sort of talking about an ideal. And so Gnosticism tends to be the upper half of the register. It tends to be where it's located, and it just depends. Sometimes it's up here, sometimes it's down here, but it's sort of about the separation of heaven and earth. And I see Christianity as the denial. Basically God gets what he wants, in that.
Yeah.
Then with the resurrection, you see the end of the age of decay. The resurrected Christ no longer subject to decay. What does that mean? And when you get down to this level of analysis and this level of definition and focus, things can tend to get weird, because, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, it's talking about Jesus having a spiritual body. Now, depending on sort of what your assumptions about what you mean by spirit, so then we're back into this question of spirit versus flesh, mind versus matter. I mean, some of these dualities, and you just start working through these things. So James Lindsay talking about Gnosticism is sort of interesting, given his roots as a new atheist, and just what has happened to new atheism itself is sort of a fascinating story, in that you've got some new atheists like James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, who have in some ways sort of become completely aligned with conservative Christians. You would just think, this is just insane. And so, but that's the way these kind of fights go, I guess. So yeah, that's Gnosticism is a difficult, when you want to talk about Gnosticism, at some point you're always going to have a conversation like, okay, what exactly are we talking about? Because the definition is so broad, and people are just trying to stay on the same page and have a productive conversation.
Yeah, I agree. Like a lot of what I think, a lot of the dangers I think with Gnosticism is within Gnosticism there is also sorcery, and to me, like, there's a really interesting paradigm that I've sort of been noticing, an interesting pattern I've been noticing within it, looking at a phenomenon, looking at a discipline, and gaining insight from it is an incredible human experience. But the switch that can happen on everyone, feels like there is a mode in which they can project it and a mode in which they can reflect it onto them. And like Gnosticism is very, very easy to project things, because it's more and more into the head, like you said. I think Judas being the hero is like a call to the kind of person, a lot of the kinds of people who start to say, well, there's no such thing as good or evil, because no action is complete without declaring the opposite. And everybody sort of goes, well, there is no such thing as good and evil. Ultimately, it's all comes out, and it is that idea that they are more, because they know that is the process in which they sort of are coming to a spiritual revelation. The interesting thing I've noticed as well is the interesting thing that Nate sort of always wants to remember is that mysticism, yes, mysticism is a necessary part of a spiritual experience, which is what the Gnostics sort of promote, I guess, or embody the most. Like to say, go with James Lindsay, Alexandria was blocked out by Jerusalem and Athens. And to me, like in the truest sense of like what unavoidable Gnosticism or what to me, like if you can replace Christianity and Judaism, and like if you can see Judaism and Greco-Roman sort of politics and culture in life and the way in which mysticism was done, and you can trying to see them with as little particularity as possible, the more like just in the raw form ideas they are, it seems like a, they are lenses in which we see the world. And you can't have a fully material lens because there's too much world, you'll get nothing done. It's you can't explain anything because there's nothing is in root common to each other. And you also can't be too ideal because before long you'll be talking about things that have no relevance to the connection of the world that you're in.
Right.
And
right.
Mysticism isn't mysticism kind of reminds me about more like faith. It's this unavoidable thing that you have to have when you want to act in the world. There's this like to me, faith is this action that is constant. Like that was something that I learned as well. It was like learning that faith and doubt weren't opposites. It was faith and inaction, because I'm always operating on a basis of faith. Like, I mean, I'm talking to you on the other side of the world.
Faith and doubt are in that sense sort of an opponent processing.
Yeah.
You don't want to, people who have faith, people who have no discrimination with respect to faith, wind up dead pretty fast because they trust too much. People who have no resistance to doubt never do anything because they trust too little. And so faith and doubt are sort of an opponent processing. Mysticism, like Gnosticism, is one of those words that you sort of have to be careful with, in that, okay, well, what exactly are we talking about with respect to mysticism? Because it can very much have a phenomenological referent in which multiple religions sort of share practice and an experience of, then you can try to describe the ineffable experience that mysticism points to, which is of course always difficult. And but it's you then do have to, because mysticism tends to point to an ineffable experience, which you can find the Apostle Paul, for example, referring to an ineffable experience, and you can find people of various religions and people with many other things in this world pointing to ineffable experiences. Obviously, the difficulty you have in everyone pointing to ineffable experiences is the things that all these experiences have in common is ineffability. That won't really help you if you're trying to connect, and this is again where heaven and earth, if you're trying to connect those experiences with the far broader menu of action that human life both requires, and I think all of us rightly assert human life should have. So and so I think, like with many things, there's sort of you can run into trouble by just blanketly denying mysticism and say, oh, it's a whole bunch of BS. I don't think it's a bunch of BS. I don't think you would have experiences like this that have been as formative and profound within human history if it was all simply BS. But at the same time, you can make too much of it because, all right, well, if you're really into that, you should probably just become a monk because that's where you'll really be able to get into that. And as you said about, Buddhism, in terms of scaling out within, let's say, a full cultural framework, it requires sort of that full cultural framework, much of which has broken down in many places of the world. Not all the Roman Catholics continue to have a monastic tradition. The Orthodox continue to have a monastic tradition, and there are other religions that have significant monastic traditions. So to me, the easiest way to point to that is to say that's a register of life as human beings. It's extremely difficult to compare the ineffable using all of these tools that we tend to use to draw distinctions, because again, back to the definition of ineffable, how are you going to analyze, pull down? I mean, you can't do it. So just there it is. That's what it is. And but if you're asking things like, what does it mean to, what do I need to do to construct a life in this world? Well, unless you're going to sort of go into that, it's just going to be a sort of over there. So that's, and so in a lot of ways, what I find is a lot of the conversations around mysticism tend to be either promotion, defensiveness around it, or attacking it. But it's very difficult to talk about the it, because by definition, that it resists explication with the tools we generally use to explain. So that's kind of how I look on that.
Yeah, definitely.
That thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense, and also makes sense as to, like, you almost can't get rid of it as well, because everybody has ineffable experiences. I think one of the most interesting things is how in this sort of age of decay kind of world, everybody makes a religion out of everything.
Yes, indeed.
Because there is a spiritual, there is a mystical aspect to driving a car or writing a novel, or, I used to be a bartender, making a drink and things like that.
Yep.
And it's very easy to, I think people are much happier leaving people in those corners without really knowing what that actually does. Because I think to see it as someone fits within a world as a monk makes a lot of sense, because a lot of problems that I see is when people think everybody should be feeling what they're feeling when they're doing it.
It's a generous thought, but it doesn't scale well or easily. Think about, for example, one of the most common ineffable experiences that human beings have is, let's say, sexual orgasm. And it's like, okay, describe your orgasm to me. And so on one hand, well, you can go ahead and try, and people certainly do, but a described orgasm is a very different thing from the orgasm itself. and nobody around the world is going to say orgasms don't exist. No, they really do exist. People aren't going to sort of dismiss orgasms as satanic. No, there are better and worse settings for orgasms, but orgasms happen. So
it's always going to be there. It's
well, we hope.
Definitely. It's really interesting, because I think that was like that mindset of trying to explain the orgasm is that trying to explain people into utopia.
Well, C.S. Lewis has this great illustration where trying to talk about sex to a child, hopefully a child who has been brought up well, has never experienced sex, is naive, et cetera, all that wonderful. And the child asks, will there be chocolate? and and the adult is kind of thinking, you know, it's
In a
just
funny
that
way.
the child can't, because it's sort of the inside outside thing where, you know, if you have experienced sexual orgasm, you have a certain knowledge. There's been an initiation into it that the child, praise be to God, has not had. And so the question is, does it involve chocolate? Is a fun question, which reveals that the child is happily naive. And we hope that, you know, it's quite likely that the child at some point will experience this very common form of human ineffability, and then the chocolate question will be answered.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it makes sense. The way in which, do you think the ineffable experience is one of the contributions to the decay of the world? Because a lot of the problems that I see, the main reason people are less comfortable within different groups, or people feel judged by a certain group, or people feel critical. Like we just had Cardinal Pell pass away, and in the Catholic Church this is a tragedy, but in the secular world this is a victory.
Oh, Cardinal Pell was he was a major pedophilia case in Australia, because I remember when I was in Australia, someone was talking to me about Cardinal Pell.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, I don't know, so I'm going to explain this terribly, but I'll do it. He was a bishop during a large amount of pedophilia cases.
Okay.
He was accused and exonerated, but essentially he was not. It looked like from the outside he was permitting it, not firing people, not punishing people. I'm only just really learning the Catholic position on this now. So I don't know quite exactly how to back the horse, but most of my secular friends are going like, they might like very, very violently like going, absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's
amazing that a world full of people who tend to be liberationist with respect to sexuality are can very quickly become extremely judgmental and demanding when it comes to an incident like this. It's like, oh, so and this is where we don't really leave our tyrannies. We don't usually exile our tyrannies too far. We want them within reach when we think they need to be applied. So
yeah, definitely. It's interesting being in the Catholic circle after being on the outside for so long, because I mean nobody really complains about Orthodox people that much.
That's because nobody knows about them. They're at least in our parts of the world, there are so few of them. They haven't had a chance to scale up and get themselves into trouble that gets in the newspaper yet. But
yeah, exactly.
I will assume that if you go into behind the Iron Curtain, part of the reason for this was of course the Iron Curtain itself, which sort of suppressed all of that and kept all that away. And now, of course, it's but you asked about the age of decay and the ineffable. And again, I think Lewis is super helpful with this, in that the ineffable, because it tends to be upper register, is part of our experience of non-decay. The ineffable experience tends to be an eternal experience. It's a timeless experience. You generally speaking, and again, I'll use what a crazy conversation, how the orgasm has come up into this. Beware of your illustrations, because they will haunt you. But I mean, one doesn't generally look at their watch in the middle of an orgasm because they want to. I mean, you have to, you sort of have a sense that that's sort of eternal. And again, in descriptions or referring to ineffability, like the Apostle Paul does in the New Testament, no eye has seen, no ear has heard. I mean, these kinds of things tend to be eternal as register, and so not sort of chronological time. They're kairos time, not chronos time. So and that's very much part of the biblical conversation with respect to decay, and that's also part of the debate that goes on even within this little corner about, well, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about the eschaton? Is it sort of a register shift where it all goes to upper register, or is it something that we move into at some point? I mean, Jesus, for example, this week in my sermon, there's more references of, when the Son of Man comes. There was in my last week's sermon, and there are in this week's sermon. Jesus continues to talk in the Gospels about the coming of the Son of Man as a culmination of a lot of the processes and struggles that are going on. The coming of the Son of Man is when the weeds and the wheat are harvested together. The coming of the Son of Man is when the dragnet takes all of these fish out of the sea and they get separated. So the New Testament very much places that on a timeline. It's hard not to see it that way, but that then invokes a lot of conversation about the fact that the ineffable, even though the age of decay is still very much running in the lower register, we as Christians taste and touch the ineffable even while we're in the age of decay. And you see the Apostle Paul sort of working through that. Outwardly, we are decaying away. Inwardly, in a sense, the kingdom is arising. And that then, I know Nate and Aaron want to do a conversation about hell, which I'll probably agree to because I say yes to way too many things, even things that can get me into trouble. But those are some of the issues that get involved in this. And what you see in the Gospels is that it's really hard to talk about these things. And in that way, in some ways, mythological language usually we sort of erupts.
Well, yeah. I think a lot. Like, I've been reading On Fairy Stories again, by Tolkien, and I think he talks a lot about where that there's a place for the ineffable in the world, like in that lower register. It's funny, going back to your illustration as well. He actually says that one can only enter into fairy with the innocence of a child. And in that sense, it's almost like you actually have to still be low enough. You have to be low enough to see the world without judging it, without pushing down onto it. But at the same time, it is that place where, I mean, he says it himself, like, you are out of time. You are sort of seeing, like, it feels like the fairy realm, or whatever that is. It feels like that is the imaginal perspective of looking at a place. You can see higher philosophies into it, but they are very easily hidden, and they are very easily overwhelmed by other factors that you can be seen with. I was saying with Nate, it's like, that's like, actually, you said nature is our sister, like the Lewis quote. In the fairy realm, that's where you can see that, because in the upper register, the very high thing is like, oh, nature is our mother, because that's where we come from. That's where we've arisen out of. But it's like, no, nature is our sister because we are growing alongside it, because I'm here and seeing it. I'm actually participating it feels like there is this place where I wouldn't quite know where to go with this, aside from the fact that like fairy doesn't seem to be definable in any other term aside from fairy, which is very strange because I think like mythology has a certain sense and hagiography has a certain sense. Fairy is we've used fairy tales our entire lives, but there is this thing that there is an ineffability about the perspective of fairy that almost seems to be necessary in the way that you see it, in the way that you enter into it, in the way that you behave with it. But it's also, I feel like it is that it feels like it is the meeting point of significance, ideal, and unattainable reality.
Right, right. It's why LARPing is so much fun, live action role playing. It's why LARPing is so much fun, because you can, in a sense, you can read a book about Middle Earth, and that can be a wonderful experience. But it's why people make pilgrimages to Peter Jackson's set in New Zealand, because and the same reason why people make pilgrimages to the Sea of Galilee and to the Temple Mount and to all of these places, because once, you know, in a sense, if you're reading Tolkien, you're sort of up here and you're imagining Middle Earth and Aragorn and the hobbits and all of that. And then you visit Hobbiton, even knowing full well that it's just a set put up by Peter Jackson, or you go to that valley where, you know, that you go to that beautiful valley where Edoras, you know, the throne of the Rohirrim was, and you know, you can watch the little supplemental materials to Peter Jackson's movies. And so in other words, there is, and I think this is why Gnosticism finally lost to Christianity, because we are embodied creatures. We long to have, you know, what's the competition between reading Lord of the Rings and having an orgasm? That's a complicated thing to answer. Now, if your orgasm is set within, let's say, a marriage, a lifelong commitment to another person, where there are children, you know, there's extended family, there's a home, you know, suddenly you begin to recognize that what we do as human beings is, we sort of nest, you know, we nest heaven in earth. And you know, Peugeot talks about that fairly consistently in the Exodus seminar, that there's this there's a desire on God's part to embody, which is of course the incarnation. And that's part of why Christian theology takes the form it does. It's why Nate keeps talking about
Christology, and
Nate keeps talking about Christology. Hang on, I'm gonna have to answer the doorbell here.
Right.
All right. So sorry about the interruption.
That's right. Yeah, the Christology that Nate talks about is really interesting, because it almost becomes everything is just the image of Christ, and that's it. It expands out and it just becomes this entirely reflective thing. I'm not sure if you've been watching the conversations with Raj, but yeah, there's a lot within that. It's just like, oh, okay, it's just fully coming out.
Raj, you know, Raj and I have had some interesting conversations, because you know, he talks about the guru and in Sikhi, and the relationship between the guru and Christians looking at Christ. So and that's also, though, I think where these questions where Christians start talking about the resurrection, you know, in terms of the historical resurrection or the physical resurrection of Christ. I mean, that's sort of where these things begin to come down together, because the resurrection then becomes an event which enlivens our hope that the physicality that we will enjoy now, many religions imagine a continuation of our story through, you know, apart from physicality, you know, ghosts, happy hunting grounds, you know, Sheol. I mean, many religions have that. The idea, you know, part of the reason Christianity made such a huge splash was the argument that Jesus rose from the dead. It's very difficult to, you know, Christianity and other religions can have a lot in common with respect to an afterlife, moral foundation, you know, connections to, let's say, you know, Platonism. I mean, there's a lot that's around there that people can sort of tie into, but the assertion that that death was conquered by not a mythological character, and of course Lewis writes about this more than anyone, not a mythological character, but by a character that is as much a flesh and bone as I am and as you are. Now suddenly that lifts our imagination and our attention to a whole new level. Because then suddenly, and then the story is not that, okay, Jesus managed to attain this, which, okay, fair enough, but I can participate in that resurrection in as physical a way as Christ did. Wow, that's a claim. That, and Lewis writes about this better than just about anyone. That's a claim that begins sort of stopping everyone else short. Muhammad doesn't claim that. No. You know, Moses doesn't claim that. None of the other, you know, the Siddhartha Gautama doesn't claim that. That's an amazing claim. And as Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, well, if it's a lie, then we are, you know, we are as pitiable as any new atheist might say that we are, because we are placing an enormous hope. It might not be that bad because we're participating in all of these other ancient philosophical systems, and okay, but the argument that there's a lot that hinges on that point that Lewis really drove into for him, and I think, you know, really changed his life. So, and I think that, and for me, that's a big part of why I continue to be the kind of Christian that I am.
It seems like the best description I remember of that issue was when Peterson was talking with Peugeot just as he was getting better, and he nearly broke down into tears when he said sometimes the material and the narrative touch.
Exactly.
And yeah, I think it is a crazy thing. Like, I said that on Jacob's stream. I said the
oh, you're on Jacob's channel too?
Yeah, I haven't one-on-one with him. I just tagged onto it chatting. He's hilarious. And
I can't wait to see what he's gonna say about this video.
Yeah, definitely. He said, I said, I was like, I think I think at the end, like, in some senses, you do always have to kind of remember, like, the resurrection is just, it's ridiculous. Like, if you think about it in context of so much, it's like, it's kind of hilarious. And Jacob's like, I agree 100%. But, like, you know, it's I always like try to take it on balance, because it is that there is this like incredibly sacred moment. It's almost like the ineffable has gets to become an experience that we can share, that is real, that can exist within the world, that is something that we can participate in and stuff like that. Because it's like, if you think about it on an individual level, like the material and the narrative touch all the time. And it's always like, you know, I can think like every significant memory that you ever have, I suppose, is one of those moments. Or even when you just think about yourself in a different way. When I when I became a when I called myself a poet, I kept on going back in my mind, going, oh, when did I like poetry? And, you know, more and more moments were kind of always found when I was just like, oh, this is why I've sort of done it. This is why I've sort of embodied that sort of moment. And it's like, you know, it is that collision where meaning and, you know, the present circumstances find themselves perfectly aligned. But that's hard to do for a family. That's hard to do for a neighborhood. That's hard to scale out.
Right.
And yeah, like it's interesting because all the talk on Christ and everything, he is that scale. Like he is the thing that scales. And it's partly because he's a man, and it's partly because he conquered death, and he's partly because he's the son of God. It seems like there is
It's almost the
everything else
definition
is,
of son of God.
yeah. Hmm?
It's almost the definition of son of God. We in the
Yeah.
West, we tend to think, when we think about
It's
God,
the scale, yeah.
because that's what a son of God is
Yeah.
that's what a son of God does. I mean, it's that language hooks up. And
Mm,
and the fact that you have, you know, an entire civilization rolling out, and
mm,
even though that, you know, like all civilizations within the age of decay, it's always undergoing some transformation of decay and renewal.
mm.
Peterson recently, I think, I forget which conversation it was in. It was either in the Louise Perry conversation or the Roy Sabag conversation, you know, talked about the fact that I mean, biologically, we're always dying and renewing. If our cells don't die, they tend to become cancerous, and then, you know, they become sort
Yeah.
of an unstable life that will self-terminate, a parasitic life. But healthy life is always that. And so that's where, you know, even the dying and renewing is sort of all part of a continual cycle, even though there's a definitive dying and renewing, making all such
Yeah.
other things derivative and participatory of the one essential thing. And so, I mean, part of the reason we keep bumping into so many of these relationships over and over again is because they are, and Peugeot talks about this in better terms than most, that they do sort of continue to fractal and repeat within the world. And that's why the Christian story that you find in the Bible is both sort of a perennial story. It describes the world as it is, but it is also an instantiated story that has living persons and events, and, you know, in sort of that common sense frame that we tend to look at. And that's because it has both. It competes against, you know, the continual perennialism that tends to be detached from earth, and it competes against the perennial earthiness that can't actually touch the eternality of the upper register. That sounds,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that description communicated a lot, but
Well, there's also like the individual exclusive part of the lower register,
right,
like the environmental factor. Like I still always like, I find it so curious when I learn, you know, you hear about the connections of like Christianity to pagan rituals, and like this is when Christmas was because you see the thing, and I'm like, and I find it really interesting because I'm in Australia. Christmas is in summer.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yep,
there is no
yep,
connection to those types of festivals. So it's like
yep.
in some ways it feels different, and in some ways it's like it you're like, oh yeah, well it makes sense. You should have a feast in the middle of winter when you're all miserable and you have to make each other happy and stuff like that. But in the summer, it's just kind of like, all right, I guess we'll meet up next Tuesday and like go to the beach one more time, I guess. And that particularity that the the earth sort of has to be, you have to be real, but to nest it in a universal is does seem to be the goal of Christianity. The interesting thing, like, I don't know, I've heard some stuff in your videos that sort of point to this as well. Like the church almost kind of the church is this the church is this is a symbol of the ideal. The church is the symbol of the perennial place. The problem is it has to exist, and in existing gets caught in the decay and renewal
Right.
of time itself.
Yeah. The church is right there in the middle.
Yeah. And like a lot of the big problems I see within like when people criticize Christianity and when people criticize religion, they're looking at they're looking at the earthliness. They're looking at what its fruits in sort of like its bad fruits, and going like, oh well, how do you have such a, like, you have this ideal, you are above, you are like, literally
If you were so ideal, how could all of this child molestation happen? It's a very fair point.
Oh,
That's why it's so devastating.
Yeah.
But you can only sort of leverage that point if you can also say child molestation doesn't happen in schools, secular schools. Why is child molestation so devastating in the church, but not in your secular educational institutions? Well, obviously it's devastating to the children in either place. But of course, it's because the church has this connection to the upper register. And and of course, nobody, I mean, Jesus more than anyone puts the conversation about hypocrisy on the map. And Jesus launches a whole new way of talking about hypocrisy, and that that rhetorical tool of using hypocrisy to challenge institutions that are supposed to be upper register, and in Jesus' case, it's the religious establishment of his day. He's basically saying, but of course, Jesus goes back to the Old Testament prophets who did exactly the same thing. You march into the kings and you say, you are the king, you are the sub-regent of the Lord of heaven and earth, and this is how you behave.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing as well is like, I talk about this a lot, and I sort of like I'm trying to make sure I distill this thought a lot. I smoked for 12 years straight, and one of the big thing that got me to quit was realizing my life was not going to be different. It was not my physical experience that was actually going to change. And when I did that, I stopped making this smoking, non-smoking thing a judge for me. I stopped thinking it in a way of like, I still find it funny. I was like, oh yeah, when I quit smoking, I'll no longer have desires or addictions. I'll never have something craving that I'll submit to. I'll have an ironclad will. I'll be able to organize. Then, it just scales on and on. And it's just like, well, no, the thing that I'm doing is not, I'm not doing it for myself, because in a sense, like I want to do it because I'm healthier, but that actually depends on a lot more aside from what you like, aside from smoking. And it is one of those things where it's like the less I put myself into that judgmental spot, the more I could do something that was a better ideal, a better good. And I feel like a lot of the times when people do criticize, when people criticize Peterson, I see it a lot. And I really see how this affects the discussion around Andrew Tate, actually, because a lot of the problems that when people bring up the issues with Andrew Tate, it's like, oh, he's a misogynist, oh, he's talking crap, oh, he's this, oh, he's that. A lot of what that is an immediate judgment and a projection of what they see him doing and how that ideal and how that fits within their ideals. And they're like, this is absolutely wrong.
Right.
Whereas the young men that are, I mean, I don't think Andrew Tate's, a clear and cut story either way, but what I like, the reason why he is a fanatical person, the reason why he has fans, the reason why he has a following is because there are people who didn't look at their life in that way before and who are starting to look at their life going like, oh, that's what it's doing to me. That's what this is happening to me. It's like there is this, in a sense, there is like they've been going either which way, but now what they're doing is they're taking those moments that they don't pay attention to, those violent moments, those competitive moments, those objectifying moments, and now they're reflecting on it and taking it into account. And like, I mean, Peterson was the best. Peterson's been the best at this because, he rattled my life completely. In some sense, I still feel recovering from it. You don't, like when he said like you could fill a library with what you don't know. And before that, I did not let myself really think that much. I was like, no, it is this. It is this.
Yeah.
This is the way that you should behave. This is the way that you should do. And not knowing really, not with any false intention or anything, I started projecting that ideal onto the world.
Yeah.
And started saying that if you don't fit this idea, then you're wrong. And it's in that discussion, I'm putting myself here, but what I'm doing is all I'm seeing is here.
Yeah.
Whereas if you, like, when I sort of realized in the smoking sort of way, if I put myself right in the middle, that's where I can see the ideal in the real, and where I can also see where the real becomes the ideal. And it's that process is a strange, that's where sort of my Buddhism sort of kicks in, and I realize like there is a certain surrender that you have to do. Like I talk about Athens and Greece, Judaism and Greek pantheism. I talk about that as the discussion between acceptance and dominance. Because in some way we have to exist. We have to exert our will into the world in order to live. But that acceptance, that understanding that this is all part of time and it is not our body that we're sort of paying attention to. We are actually like, there is an obedience to it. Like the one thing I've been really appreciating about Jacob is learning the Jewish interpretation of the Bible,
or at least Jewish interpretation. So
yes,
make sure you listen to Yosef Hezi there too, because
yes, I did listen to. I was listening to.
It's easy to have Jacob be the voice of canonical Judaism until you meet another Jew.
Yeah,
same with Christianity. So,
yeah, definitely.
Same thing.
Yeah, especially the ones with the loudest voices. They're
That's
just
right.
like, this is it. but like his perspective is like it is, he is reading it like a law. And you don't see that in Christianity, where it's like, oh no, obey this and then you're all good.
Right.
It's like if you obey the law, you're not good. You're doing your job. You're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
It's not that you're getting rewarded for obeying the law. You don't get rewarded for obeying the law. You just don't get punished and you don't get judged. And it's just like it's a very interesting thing. But and I feel like there is more to that than I'm sort of ready to know yet. But I think the problem with the secular world is we've kept Athens but lost Jerusalem, because in a lot of senses it's really easy to make an ideal, and it's really easy to think about how things could be better, but it's a lot harder to accept things how they are. And I think because of that, there's the crisis in masculinity comes from the fact that all we have is the masculine. All we have is the dominance. All we have is this pushing out into the world, and we don't have this acceptance, this obedience to anything, to nature, to society, to stuff like that. I mean, unwillingly, unwittingly, we can find ourselves in it. I always like find that Shakespeare quote, "Misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows." And you find yourself with like, you're just like, all right, I didn't think I'd have to accept it here.
That's very true. That's very true. Well, we should land the plane on this.
Yeah, definitely.
But this was enjoyable. I don't know if this is something that that you think would be appropriate for me to share on my channel.
Yeah. Oh no, happily.
Okay.
I'll put it up. I'll come better. I like learning. I like re-listening to my conversations because I get to pay attention to what I didn't listen to.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. And also, if it gets posted on the channel, then what the fun about that is that then others get to play along, and there's really a lot of good, thoughtful people in the comment section who there's not very many trolls actually, but most of them are good, thoughtful people, and you can there's some of them are encouraging, and there's usually something to be learned. So
yeah, definitely.
Well, anyway,
thank you so
Charlie,
much for the time.
I'm glad we could do this. Sun is coming up, and
I've been wanting to do it for such a long time. It's really, really great to actually talk to you finally.
Well, I'm glad we're able to do this. So you take care of yourself and enjoy the day.
Yeah, you too, mate.
All right.
Enjoy your evening.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.